Only our 10th Prime Minister can save Australia. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
Well, interesting challenge here. Who is our 10th Prime Minister? I've never heard of him.
Aha. So before we reveal the identity, because I'm sure a lot of our audience wouldn't know who the 10th Prime Minister is because it is a little bit obscure in terms of the history books. But in our last conversation, when we said that Australia has run out of luck, and we talked about the state of the economy, we've talked about the response to COVID in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and the hole is so big that we really can't dig out of ourselves. And we went through 10 steps as to why we don't think we can grow our way out of the debt like we did after World War II. And at the end of the conversation, I had 9 points and you added a 10th point. And you said political leadership is one of the big inhibiting factors about how can we recover as an economy, as a society from where we are today. And so the point of this episode is to say to you is that there's only one person who I believe can save the country. Now, the unfortunate thing is he's dead. but this individual, the 10th Prime Minister, he's probably one of my biggest political hero. And there is, once you look at the story of this man, so it's Joseph Lyons, who was the Prime Minister during the Great Depression. You learn about what I think is real political leadership, real statesmanship, and he is someone I think Australians should know a lot more about. And we're going to go through his life history. We're going to go through the context of his times, what he did as the Tasmanian Premier, and then what he did in federal parliament, which was unique in I think, in Australian federal political history, and the lessons we can draw from that in the current context. So that is the person we're talking about, the 10th Prime Minister. Right,
and it's probably worth saying that he's a pretty polarising figure even today, right? There are many people who really don't have much time for him.
Yes. We'll get into why that is, but he has, in many respects, been airbrushed from the history books, and a lot of Australians don't learn about him. And really, I didn't know anything about Joseph Lyons until I picked up a number of history books about Australia and started reading about what would actually happen before the Second World War. And once you actually go through the record, it is quite extraordinary. So just before we get into some detail, now, why do I think that Joseph Lyons is the only person who can save us? So, in my view, the most courageous Prime Minister we've ever had, and this may be controversial for some, but I think more courageous than Curtin in World War II. The most principled Prime Minister we've ever had, the most courageous, undefeated at the federal level, in terms of when he was Prime Minister, three consecutive election victories before he died in office in 1939. He saved Tasmania from bankruptcy. So Tasmania was, in 1923, was on the verge of going bankrupt, and he saved his own state. And then, having saved Tasmania, he went to the federal parliament and he saved the finances of the Australian government as well as the state governments as well during the Great Depression. So a huge record of achievement, principled leadership, and he was willing to put it all on the line because of love of country. And for those who are not aware, Joseph Lyons was initially in the Labor Party, and we typically don't view the Labor Party as a political party that saves governments from financial ruin, but this person was quite unique in that sense, and we'll get into that in a short while. But where I want to take the conversation is, in 2017, I had the opportunity to write an article for news.com.au, and I actually took this concept from sports. So you see a lot of debating shows in sport around the world about who's the greatest in this particular sport, whether it's basketball or football or rugby league or soccer, whatever. And so I thought to myself, well, no one in Australia has really put the 10 greatest of all time political figures in Australian history. So I pitched this to news.com, and they said this is a really interesting concept. So let's actually put it together, and then you come up with your list, and we'll actually publish it. So we did publish it, and people can still read my list from 2017. So let's actually put that on the screen. But at the time, I actually had 6 core criteria that I thought were important about how do you define greatness. And this was about personal courage, acting in the public or national interest, leadership, foresight, consistency, and impact. And when I looked at all of those 6 components, and I thought to myself, which person is the greatest of all time in Australian history? Joseph Lyons is number 1 on my list.
Okay, and that went right the way back to what, 1788 or something, right?
Yes. So there's a few people in the top 10 from the 19th century, and there are a few people from the 20th century. But there were some people who were quite surprised. I mean, for example, Robert Menzies, who's the longest serving Prime Minister, was not in my top 10. Bob Hawke, not in my top 10. Whitlam, not in my top 10. So there are some common names. There are some names that people never heard of before. And obviously, for people to think that Joseph Lyons is the greatest of all time, that was, a bit surprising to some people. But it was a good conversation starter, and got a few people interested to think of, well, what has actually happened. And people who are political junkies who I've been talking to over the last few years about this, some of them have said that Menzies is the greatest of all time, and as we've gone through the Lyons record, they've actually changed their mind and said, no, you actually make a compelling case, and they say, no, Lyons is the greatest of all time. So that's why I think he's the only one who has a chance of helping us in our hour of need.
And it's worth saying also that Lyons, of course, was there at the time of great financial and economic crisis.
Yes.
So it needed significant leadership, and it needed some very clear thinking to be able to navigate that.
Indeed. So before we go into the achievements of Lyons, I just want to give the audience a bit of a summary of who Lyons was. So born in Tasmania on the 15th of September 1879, Irish Catholic. Now, he joined the Labor Party while he was very young and started off his career as a school teacher. Married in 1915, so just in his early 30s. Ended up having 11 children, so a very big Irish Catholic family in Australia. Elected to the Tasmanian Assembly in 1909 at the age of 30. He became treasurer in 1912. So basically 3 years in, at 33 years old, treasurer of Tasmania, and served for a couple of years until that particular government lost office in 1914 at the start of World War One. He became the leader of the Tasmanian Labor Party in 1916. And then he was appointed Premier in October 1923. And he served a minority government. He then went on to win the 1925 election in Tasmania. And then in the 1925, he won a majority government. By 1928, he didn't win a majority government, but he had the opportunity to form a coalition minority government, but he decided not to because he thought it would weaken his leadership if he had a sort of coalition. So he wanted to serve in his own right. So he decided not to go into government, but he had enough to go if he wanted to. And then he was tapped on the shoulder by Scullin, who went on to win the 1929 federal election, and he was asked, would you like to switch from Tasmanian politics to federal politics? So he made the switch there. So elected in 1929 to the federal parliament. He became the Postmaster General and the Minister for Works and Railway. He then, in 1930, was tapped on the shoulder to become the acting treasurer because the substantive treasurer, Ted Theodore, had to stand aside pending a corruption investigation. And, obviously, nearly 90 years on, and there are multiple sort of investigations into all sorts of characters.
Queensland as well, right?
Indeed, Queensland, yeah. So the Ted Theodore was the Premier of Queensland before becoming the Federal Treasurer. And he was alleged to have engaged in corruption as Premier. So he said, okay, let me stand aside, let's have this investigation. So Joseph Lyons became the acting treasurer. Now, we won't go into the specifics as to why, but in January of 1931, he resigned from cabinet. In March of 1931, he quit the ALP entirely. He went to the crossbench on a matter of high public principle, which we'll get into in a minute. He then was offered by the opposition the opportunity to come and be the leader of the opposition. So he was actually a very senior cabinet minister. And then when he said, I'm not going to be a part of this government anymore, goes to the crossbench, and the opposition actually agreed with his point of view. They said, would you like to join us? He joins the opposition in, I think, May of 1931, becomes the leader, goes on to contest the 1931 election, and he won the biggest victory in Australian political history. So the two-party preferred was 58.5%, and this is still looking, even though we're in 2020 today, 1931 is the biggest victory in the history of the country. So he was very popular because of the position he took. He put his whole career on the line. And he was rewarded with a huge victory. He went on to win the 1934 and 1937 elections, and then he died in office on Good Friday in 1939 and had a huge state funeral because of how popular he was. Now, in terms of his popularity, we didn't have back then opinion polls like we do now, but by any historical objective, and I've written a number of history books about him. So prior to Kevin Rudd, Bob Hawke was the most popular on record. And then for a short amount of time during the apology, for maybe 1 or 2 months, Rudd actually outshone Hawke. But this guy was more popular than Hawke or Rudd. So immensely popular, and obviously, consecutive election victories at the federal level, as well as being very successful at the state level as well.
So Lyons moved from the ALP, moved across the other side of the house. What was the other side of the house at that point? Was it like it is today, or is it different from today?
So prior to him joining, it was called the Nationalists. So it was effectively the Conservative, the anti-Labor Party, the Conservative Party. It's called the Nationalists. Now, when he came across to symbolise to the public that patriots were coming together to do something significant for the country, they called it the United Australia Party.
Clive Palmer.
Yes. Well, so Clive Palmer's party is called the UAP, the United Australia Party, but this is actually something he copied from what Lyons actually put together.
Right.
Now, the UAP, so when Lyons passed away in 1939, the UAP basically collapsed in the 1943 general election, and then Menzies picked up the ruins of that party and formed the Liberal Party, and then obviously he went on to win election and then serve. So the UAP effectively is the predecessor to what we understand to be the Liberal Party today.
Right, but was it more centralist than the Liberals?
So generally it was a conservative party, but it was in effect an anti-debt party, and we'll get into the reasons why that is.
Okay. So obviously, John, this is in the context of the Great Depression, right? This basically set this whole thing up.
So before we get into his achievements, I think it's important that we just sort of set the scene. So yes, particularly his prime ministership was around the Great Depression.
Yep.
But there was something big happening in the 1920s as well. So let's just put this slide on the screen. Now, this is something we really haven't talked about in some detail. We may come back to a future episode. But Australia has had 3 huge deflationary episodes since the late 19th century. So, and each one has been predicated on a different debt bubble. So in the last couple of years, we've talked a lot about the household debt bubble. And obviously that poses a type of deflationary risk. And you've obviously talked about that with Harry Dent and looking at Ireland and a whole host of others. So typically when you look at economics, you can have 3 types of debt bubbles. You can have a household debt bubble, a public sector debt bubble when the government has too much debt, kind of like what Greece had in 2012 with the sovereign debt crisis, or you can have a corporate debt bubble, kind of like Turkey, for example, today, or the United States. So in the 1880s, we had a huge land bubble, household debt bubble, a lot of speculation. and obviously when that collapsed, we had the Depression in 1892. In the 1920s, we had state governments, in particular, running huge deficits after World War One, and we had a huge amount of public sector debt bubble going through to the Great Depression, and then we had a huge sort of issue in 1931 when the world credit markets froze up. And then in the 1980s, we had a corporate debt bubble, the Allen Bonds, the Christopher Scaife, and all of these people. So that in the 1991 recession, that was the collapse of the corporate debt bubble that happened there. So the real big story of the Lyons era is state governments and the federal government, to a lesser extent, running up huge debts, and our reputation internationally. Because at the time, so just to set the scene, and we've talked about this in the context of bail-in, in the 1890s, our domestic banking system collapsed, and that had huge ramifications for the next few decades. So post-World War One, when the state government started to borrow huge amounts of money to develop cities and infrastructure and to expand social services, etc., this money was not borrowed from domestic banks; it was borrowed from the banks in the UK. So that was obviously a huge issue in terms of our reputation internationally, and sort of our relationships vis-a-vis Australia and in terms of the UK. So and you know, we were running up so much debt that we had a big reputation about not being careful with money. And so let's put this quote on the screen. So this is actually from a history book that I found. There was the 1926 Imperial Conference, and a couple of London stockbrokers put out a pamphlet criticising Australia, and it said, "There is no more voracious borrower than the Australian Commonwealth." So our reputation in London was actually quite bad. So that was the sort of context of what Lyons was when he became the Premier of Tasmania, and then what he had to face when he went to the federal parliament.
So, John, what was the underlying issue around the Great Depression then?
So with all this debt we were building up during the 1920s, we had a sovereign debt crisis that morphed into a balance of payments crisis. So we've mentioned a balance of payments crisis about where we may be headed to over the next few years. And I know that I've had some feedback, and people have said, I don't understand what that means. So basically, a sovereign debt crisis is when a government has too much debt and can't meet its obligations. And then a balance of payments crisis is when you've borrowed so much money from overseas that you're struggling to pay that money back. And that is the context in which Australia had. So basically, we had so much debt that our lenders, which were the London banks, were concerned about our ability to pay. And then when the stock market crashed in October of 1929 in New York, and this caused this huge deflationary depression right throughout the world, our ability to finance ongoing expenditure as well as to meet our existing debt obligations become a real big issue. We had a credit crunch, and then we actually had to face a fork in the road, effectively, as to, well, what we were going to do. And there was some people who wanted to go down the economic stimulus path, print more money domestically, and use that money to the Scullin government wanted to have like an employment program, kind of like JobKeeper, different form, etc., to sort of minimize unemployment. And there were other people who said, no, we need to tackle these debt problems and actually have austerity, both monetary austerity in terms of not inflating the pound at the time or not inflating the dollar as in today, as well as fiscal austerity, i.e. we need to shrink these budget deficits, and we need to balance them, and we need to get our public sector debt under control.
Right. Sounds wholly familiar, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So let's go, Martin, into Lyons's record of what I call his record of achievement. Now, when we look at, so I want to first start when he was Premier during the World War I period, and then in the early 1920s. So in the 5 years between, Labour lost the government in 1914. Lyons became leader in 1916. And what we know is that
this is Tasmania we're talking about.
Tasmania, yep. Yes. The Conservatives, who were supposed to be careful with money, they actually, from 1916 to 1921, they actually doubled the debt. And by the time Lyons became the Premier in 1923, here's an amazing statistic. So if you think about the interest on the debt in 1923, it was 50% of all tax revenue. So you think of... we're slightly not in that situation now because interest rates are at a record low. But you think to yourself of all the things that a state government has to finance. Education was wholly in the bailiwick of the state government, healthcare, infrastructure, police, etc. You've got all these expenses that you've got to cover, and yet 50% of all your tax revenue has to go pay on the interest on the existing debt, which doesn't leave you much money to actually deal with the rest of the responsibilities of the state government. So they were effectively on the verge of bankruptcy, and so he came Premier, and he said, "Well, we would actually tackle this problem." Now, the interesting thing about Lyons is that he was during this time, a lot of Irish Catholics associated themselves with Labour. So they're not necessarily socialist ideologues, for example, but they were affinited. Their sort of their religion, I guess. There was a sectarian divide between Protestants and Catholics, and a lot of Catholics were in Labour. And so that's why he basically was in the Labour Party. But he was anti-debt. He hated debt, both in terms of government, but also in terms of his personal circumstances. Lived very carefully, he and his wife and all of his children. And he took that attitude into the premiership. And they basically had a huge austerity budget where they did raise some taxes. They did cut a lot of spending. They did balance the budget, and they stabilized the debt. And then by 1927, he was able to produce a huge budget surplus. And with that surplus, he was able to actually relieve some of the taxes he brought on earlier. And he was able to sort of stabilize the situation. So again, I think it was only in the last 24 hours, I think Tasmania has racked up $1 billion worth of new debt because of COVID. And yet, now, I don't think Tasmania is anywhere near this position they were in 1923, but when you've got 50% of your tax revenue going to paying just the interest, you're in pretty dire strait. And he was able to take the reins and basically implement very unpopular policies to actually save the financial position of the state government.
What was interest rates then? Presumably they were higher than they would be today.
Well, we know, I think the RBA has admitted on record that now is the lowest in Australia's history.
Yeah.
So, look, I don't have the precise figure in front of me, but I would dare say that it is substantially higher than where we are today.
Yep.
Now, so I think that the fact that he saved his state is a huge achievement. Now, when he became a minister in the federal government, so after 1929, he basically was of the same attitude, pro-austerity, balance the budget, do not inflate the pound. Now, one of the big factors that was running through the thinking at the time, and it wasn't just him, there was the mainstream media was pro-austerity in terms of the banks. Now, the forerunner to the RBA was the Commonwealth Bank, and the RBA was, they were against stimulus. Now, because we had a lot of foreign debt with the London banks, they were not interested in us repaying our loans with inflated currency. So there was a lot of pressure not to go down the stimulus path from our creditors in London. The Bank of England sent one of their officials to come and do an independent review and to provide a range of recommendations. And those recommendations were around having austerity, in terms of what we just said. when Joseph Lyons became the acting treasurer in 1930, he reached an agreement with the state premiers on what they call the Premier's Plan, which was that the federal government and the state governments across the board was going to cut spending, raise some taxes, balance the budgets, and start to pay back all this debt that we had from that we borrowed from the UK. Labour was completely against that, particularly during the early stages of the Depression, and they wanted to do what we are doing now in terms of fiscal and monetary stimulus. So now, by the January of 1931, there was a lot of pressure inside the Labour Party to bring the Treasurer back so that he could get his way. And Lyons knew that if the substantive Treasurer came back, they were going to go the stimulus path, and that was completely against what he was working on as the acting Treasurer and against his beliefs as to where Australia should go. So when the caucus voted, they voted 25-19 to bring Ted Theodore back. Immediately, Joseph Lyons and another minister resigned, and they went to the backbench and said, well, we're not going to be a part of this cabinet who are going to push the stimulus path. And then by 1931, as the rollout of the stimulus was sort of coming to fruition, they decided that they were going to, with Joseph Lyons and 4 others, decided that they were not going to be a part of the Labour Party anymore, a part of this Labour government, and that's why they quit and went to the crossbench. And I should say that at this point, there was no prospect of... so we said earlier in this conversation that Joseph Lyons went to the opposition. At that point, he didn't know that that was actually going to play out. For him, it was like, this is completely the antithesis of where we should go as a country. I'm not going to be a part of it. I'm going to throw my entire political career to one side, and I'm just going to resign on principle because stimulus is not the right way to go. And one of the important points in this whole context is this is around 1930-31. Only a few years earlier, you had the hyperinflation in Germany, and there was a lot of concern that given how indebted we were, if we tried to print our way out of it, we would be repeating the mistakes of the Germans. And obviously they were, and this was not only just in Parliament, but also in terms of the mainstream media. There was a lot of commentary about, we need to be responsible, and we shouldn't actually repeat the mistakes of history.
Right, and unemployment got incredibly high, didn't it, through this process?
Yes. So by the end of 1931, unemployment got to 29%, and by 1932, after the 31 election, unemployment got to 32%, the second highest in the developed world behind Germany. And so, but that was the cost of trying to get on top of these in terms of these debt problems. So we'll get into that point in a second, but let me just bring this up on the screen. So on this Premier's Plan, about this pro-austerity plan, Lyons basically made this point, and the quote is, "The alternative to the plan is default or inflation, either which would destroy Australia's credit and have calamitous effects." So he basically says that we've taken on this debt, we have an obligation to pay it back. No MMT, no Keynesian. John Maynard Keynes' book about the general theory was to come out some years later. So there was none of this sort of stuff. We have to pay it back. We're not going to inflate it away, because we could go like Germany. If we default, our reputation on the international credit markets would be destroyed, and we would struggle to borrow anything down the track. So we actually have to come to grips with the financial hole that we have today. And obviously in our last conversation, one of the things we've said is, well, one of the points you made is, we don't have the political leadership who's willing to actually look Australians in the eye and say, we need to come to terms with the problems we have facing Australia in 2020. So Martin, we just talked about how Lyons resigned in March of 1931. The election, so he became leader in May, 2 months after he resigns from the ALP, and then he contests the election in December and wins the biggest victory in the history of the country, which the record still stands today. Now, his resignation speech was recorded in very stark terms in the press. And let's actually put this on the screen, because I thought this was a very interesting description by a parliamentary reporter. So this is of the Lyons speech where he resigns in March of 1931 from the ALP. Quote, "A speech so eloquent, so brilliant, and so transparently sincere that it will probably go down in memory as one of the greatest heard in federal parliament. Sanity was its keynote, and a shining patriotism was its text." So we don't see that sort if only we don't see that sort of rhetoric that we have now. Now, the other thing that happened was that once he resigned, he actually went on a bit of a national tour to explain why he resigned from cabinet, why he resigned from the ALP, why it was important to implement austerity. And wherever he went around, now one of the interesting things is one of his key backers in the media was actually Keith Murdoch, which was Rupert's father. So the Murdochs were sort of a part of this, but wherever he went, he was highly popular. He had a lot of people coming out to sort of meet him and greet him. And he became a popular sensation because of his principled stand and willing to throw his political career for the sake of the country. And one of the reasons why he won the two-party preferred at 58.5 was he was able to bring a lot of Catholics as well as middle-class Labour voters towards the UAP, which was this new party, and that's obviously something that a lot of politicians struggle to do today, about uniting their own side but bringing votes, a good chunk of votes from the other side, to be able to come across. So the reason why this particular victory is so important is when I've talked to politicians this year and in the last few years about coming to terms with a household debt bubble. So they say, what should we do? Raise interest rates. And people have said to me today, like in terms of this year, when I've said stimulus has been a disaster, this is with some federal government MPs, what would you do? We need to have austerity. The refrain I continue to get from politicians in the current parliament is, if we attempt to implement austerity, we will be sacrificed on election day. And one of the key points I say to them is that in Australian history, only one man has gone to the polls with an explicit upfront austerity plan and said, we have some big problems, we're going to tackle them, we're not going to default, we're not going to inflate, we're actually going to tighten our belts, and we're going to actually come to grips with what we dug ourselves into. The only person who attempted this won the biggest victory in Australian history. And so when politicians say to me, and I've had a number of politicians this to say, we cannot win if we try this. I said, well, when someone did try it, they won, and they won big. So there is precedence. Now, it's interesting, when I've talked to some academics at the University of Wollongong, who I regularly catch up with, they've said to me that the Australia of 2020 is completely different to the Australia of 1931. And maybe, even though there is a historical precedence, you will not get the same outcome. But I dare say, if you don't try, you don't know.
Well, the point is that Lyons was there thinking about the best interests of the country. He wasn't thinking about, how do I get re-elected, right? He wasn't thinking about what the opinion polls were saying. He was actually trying to do the right thing.
Indeed.
It's not that complicated.
Yes, and on that point where he didn't care about the opinion polls and he didn't care about what would happen. I mean, here's a quote from a rally he gave in April of 1931. So this is the quote: "By heaven, I am not going to allow anyone to ruin Australia if I can lift a finger to prevent it." And so this is not just empty rhetoric. He actually meant it. He was going to move heaven and earth to save the country. And if he lost, he lost. But he wasn't going to die wondering. And that was huge. Now, one of the interesting points about the 1931 election is the Labor Party's primary vote got to 27% in that election. Now, the 2019 election last year was the second was the lowest primary vote for the Labour Party since the 1931 election.
Yep.
So that's also sort of a bit of an interesting point, that Labour in its it's like last year was its worst outcome in 90 years, and that worst outcome was when they basically got sacrificed by trying to ruin the finances of the country.
Well, there's an object lesson there. But what's interesting, John, is that his strategy, which, he drove this into the economy, it worked, didn't it?
Indeed. So we will be doing some future conversations about austerity because there are some sensitivities in our audience and across the community about, does austerity work? And obviously a lot of opposition to austerity in the UK, in Greece, in some of these European countries. Now, so the key point about Lyons's record. So just to backtrack, we talked about how he saved Tasmania. We talked about how he was willing to throw his whole political career over a matter of public importance, and he did it. And he was rewarded with the biggest victory in Australian history. Then he goes into power and he actually does what he says he does. So he wasn't just mucking around. He goes, no, I'm going to actually do it. So what was the plan? So the plan was to cut spending by 20% across the board. They did actually cut parliamentary pay. And this is a really interesting point, because throughout the year, some people put the question to Morrison, if the country is going to sacrifice with this lockdown, will politicians take some of the pain? And he said, well, no, we're not going to take a pay cut. And yet Lyons actually insisted that politicians actually took a 15% pay cut, which would be refreshing if that was to happen in Canberra today. Now, because of the austerity, so unemployment was rising sharply in 1930-31, but it did actually get slightly worse in 1932 as the austerity started. It peaked at 32%. Now, by 1936, so 4 years later, unemployment was down to single digits. So it shot up dramatically, and then it went back down to single digits within 4 years. Now, in terms of the United States, unemployment remained in double digits up until 1940, until they went into World War II. So FDR, and I know that the Citizens Party in particular have some regard for FDR. The policies that FDR implemented, which were in some regards the pro-stimulus policies, had prolonged unemployment for a decade, whereas we had higher unemployment for a short amount of time, and then we were able to get the unemployment way down. So what did Lyons do? So he did raise some taxes in the beginning, and then as things improved, he was able to cut those taxes. But he did cut spending. He was able to implement microeconomic reform. He did reduce wages, which would be extremely controversial if he did that today. And he did things to reduce business costs, so that we could become internationally competitive. And through that process, we had a flourishing manufacturing sector during the 1930s. So, and obviously he was able to sort of try to get a raw material cost down as well. So during this process, from 1929 to 1940, the Australian economy in real GDP terms grew by 16.6%. Now, the UK, which followed a very similar path to Australia during the Great Depression, grew at 24.6%, and yet the United States, in 11 years, from 1929 to 1940, only grew by 1.6%. So barely any growth in the US on the stimulus path, and when the UK and Australia actually went the austerity path, a initial significant cost to be fronted up with, but a very fast recovery when you actually implement the right sort of policy. So the key point to note is not only was there someone willing to say we need austerity, but when it was actually put into action, it worked. And that is something that Australians will not read in the mainstream media about our policy choices going forward, and what are our options, and what will work in terms of future prosperity, and what won't work. But the key point is that if you have a debt bubble, if you have a debt problem, getting on top of that debt problem right now will have some huge initial costs to deal with, unemployment, bankruptcy, etc. But once you deal with that in the right way, you can actually spur a very fast recovery like that. But if you, on the other hand, put your head in the sand and says there's no problem, and we're just going to rack up debts in perpetuity, well, we will then head into a crisis that will be far worse. And if we continue to compound that with more and more stimulus, we will see the runaway inflation. And it's interesting, we've had this debate about inflation, deflation, and the famous Jim Rogers was recently on your DFA program,
Yep.
and he said that, no, he's in my camp, that the money printing based on historical precedents, the money printing will lead to greater inflation going forward.
Yeah, and of course the MMT crowd would say, no, interest rates are really, really low, therefore it's not an issue, therefore we can borrow big and invest in the future and everything's going to be fine, right? In other words, let's not worry about the debt, right? So this is really, it is the polar point, isn't it, around all of these debates, Do you actually drive the economy one way, which is stimulus, more debt, stimulus, right? Or do you actually try and take the hard road, which is the one you've been speaking about here, which is what Lyons did? And which of those two paths actually gets us to a better point? But nobody's having that debate. Everyone's on the sort of stimulus is fine, rates are low, no problems.
Indeed. And I'm not sure if we made a point in a previous episode. I've been reading some recent history about what happened in Germany in 1921, 22, 23. And this universal consensus that we see in Australia today on the pro-stimulus path, this was prevalent throughout Germany in this period. So there are some very dangerous signs about this. Now, one of the big points to call out about why... So Lyons was not just successful from an economic point of view, but we did see examples around the world where when austerity and deflation was tried, it actually had huge social and political negative ramifications, and the worst is probably Germany. So the final years of the Weimar Republic, they did try the austerity path, the deflationary path, and that did. Now, Germany had the highest level of unemployment in the developed world, and that was so bad that it had fractured society between the extreme left of the communists and the extreme right of the Nazis. That basically that was Hitler's pathway to the chancellorship in 1933. So by 1928, in the national election, the Nazi vote was about 2.8%, and within 4 years, it was about a third of the electorate because of the huge negative ramification. Now, on the other hand, Lyons was able to keep the country together, both in terms of its politics as well as in terms of its social fabric. Although, having said that, there was a number of militant groups in Australia in this late 1920, early 30 period. So you had unions, you had the communists on one side, and then you had some, particularly ex-World War I veterans who joined a group called what they call the New Guard, which was basically a armed militia which had a secret deal with New South Wales Police to actually try to tackle on some of these other forces in terms of the society. Now, it's interesting that from some things that I've been told by people who have looked into the New Guard, that John Howard's father was actually a member of this militant group. And there is some evidence to suggest that some elements of big business was actually financing in terms of the New Guard. So some of the banks and the insurance companies and retail companies were actually providing some financial support. So, some historians have said that 1931 was the year that Australia was on the verge of civil war. But yet this political leader who implemented austerity and brought Australia back from the financial brink in the 1930s, just like he did with Tasmania in the 1920s, was able to keep the country together throughout the 1930s, and was able to put us in reasonable shape going into World War II, particularly in terms of the finances. Now, one last point about he died in 1939 in office from a heart attack. Now, he was under huge stress in 1939 because he had some big fights inside his cabinet. Now, in 1939, in the months leading to his death, Menzies, who was the treasurer, resigned, and they had an argument about money. Now, what was this? National unemployment insurance. So what we understand, the Dole, Centrelink payments, New Start, we didn't have a national scheme in 1939. There was an agreement to have some sort of scheme. Lyons was against the scheme because he said we cannot afford it. And Menzies, so one of the things that people will know about the Menzies government when he became Prime Minister was he loved to spend money. And he did run in the 1950s and 60s quite a few deficits. And so given his anti-debt, anti-spending mentality, it actually led to his death. So Mr. Austerity, basically his austerity philosophy ultimately led to him dying in office because of huge arguments and the huge stress that he was under in that thing. So when I look at the totality of this political record of achievement, of saving his state, willing to throw his political career over a matter of public principle, and I've had some politicians that I've spoke to and have said, you name me a politician in the federal parliament today who's willing to resign from cabinet and willing to resign from their own party over a policy matter. There's no one in federal politics who's willing to do that today. And then he's rewarded with the biggest victory in Australian history, and he wins 2 consecutive elections, and 34-37 runs a very successful prime ministership, and resigns. He dies in office, immensely popular. In my mind, what a hero.
Well, and the economic record stands as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So it wasn't just he said he was going to do something and he believed it. When he did it, it actually worked.
So that's really interesting, John. But I guess the points we should be talking about, are broader because we are facing into a very similar situation today. And yet the question is, do we have anybody who would stand up and do the same thing?
Indeed. So in our last show, you said we don't have the political leadership. And I would agree. I can't find anyone who could turn around, and we just had the Queensland election yesterday. I dare say that that doesn't change anything. And we've recently had the ACT election and the Northern Territory election. That hasn't changed anything. So if we're going to have a chance of turning the economy around, whether it's about the household debt bubble, the foreign debt bubble, or this emerging public sector debt crisis that we're walking ourselves into over the next few years, we need completely new leadership, a completely new approach, someone who's willing to tell the public like it is, has the courage of their convictions, and willing to actually take it to the people, get elected, and actually get it done. And we have someone who has done that, a stellar record, and therefore I say, if you say, who is that person going to emerge? My message is only the 10th Prime Minister can save the country.
Right. We need somebody to stand up, because at the moment, frankly, there's nobody that I can see that would tell it as it is, would be true to their convictions, and would follow through, which is precisely what he did.
Indeed. So for those audience members who have never heard about the 10th Prime Minister, there's a lot of interesting books out there about his record and what he actually did. And there's been, some of these books are quite new in the last 10 years, etc. So there's a lot of material to actually go read. So, but of all the sort of stories that we can bring to our audience about where we need to go and who can take us there, I think Lyons is a case study that Australians should learn about and see whether we can replicate history.
Yes, and don't just take whatever else is saying as the only way to be the only way. There may be another way.
Indeed.
John, I appreciate your time today. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, Interested People. We'll see you next time.